I read this book a couple of weeks ago and absolutely loved it. I've promoted it to 4 or 5 friends and family members over the last few days. And what I want to do today is read from my copy of Tequila Oil by Hugh Thomson. In 1979, as an 18-year-old, he went to Mexico and had some amazing adventures. Let's have a look at it. Here's the comment from the flyleaf. Try this tequila oil, Huguito. Just as the alcohol hits your stomach, the chili will as well, and blow it back into your brains. It will take your head off. On his first trip to Mexico in the 1970s, Hugh Thomson is told by a stranger he could make money buying a car over the Texan border and taking it thousands of miles through the country to sell on the black market in Central America. What does it matter that he doesn't have a driving license? He's 18 years old, far from home, and with time to kill. It sounds like the most sensible plan in the world. Throwing himself on the kindness and mercy of the Mexicans he meets or crashes into, he and his beloved Oldsmobile 98 career from one crisis to another before meeting their apocalyptic destiny in the slums of Belize City, where he returns many years later, older but not necessarily wiser, to complete his original journey. I'm going to share some aspects of the book, the section where he writes about going back to Belize 25 years after arriving with the car. I'm going to leave that for you to read when you get your own copy of the book. Hugh Thomson has no intention of formally registering the car. He takes it across the border from El Paso in Texas into Ciudad Juarez, the Mexican town on the southern side of the border. I had no intention of going to the registration office. There were several reasons for this. For a start, I had no insurance, nor did I intend to get any. I also had no money to pay any registration fee. I figured in Mexico no one was going to worry too much. More seriously, I didn't have a driving license of any sort. In fact, not to put too fine a point on it, and it was something I had only half admitted to myself, I didn't know how to drive. Which was why I had let my friend Fernando do the honours when we bought the car a few hours before. I thought it was time to break this last bit of bad news to Fernando, that I couldn't drive and didn't have a license. He took it very calmly. Hombre, no importa nada. Man, that doesn't matter. No one in Mexico knows how to drive anyway. He said this in his usual deadpan way. I thought he was joking. Thank God the car was an automatic. All you do, said Fernando, is engage the drive, and he made the same elegant unravelling of a carpet gesture that everyone else did, implying that the miles would fall away ahead of me. I tried, and it did indeed seem remarkably easy. I lit a cigarette with the car lighter, turned on the radio. Jesus, I forgot to try the cassette machine. I burrowed around in my precious plastic bag for some cassette tapes. Elvis Costello, Oliver's Army is here to stay, and I would rather be anywhere else than here today. Chingada madre, said Fernando. What the fuck is that music? Crossing the border was a breeze. Rick waved me through without a glance. Have a nice day, or should I say, what a delightfully nice day we're having, he smirked, and I smiled to myself as we cruised onto the next controls at the Mexican end. This was the bit I was worried about. I didn't want to have to bring the car into Mexico formally, which would have needed the correct papers, my passport stamped, and, if I were trying to sell the car, retrospective duty of 100%. A guard came over. I waved my passport at him, like a good luck charm. ¿De quién es el carro? Whose car is this? We borrowed it from a friend. We're just visiting Juarez for the night. Por la noche? For the night, said the guard. The guard made an obscene movement that pushed his carbine against the side of the car door. He leered at us and waved us on. I left Fernando at the first bar as he had wanted. We had a final couple of drinks, a celebratory bandera or flag, where you lined up shots of red, white and green for the Mexican colours, sangrita, tequila and a lime chaser for good measure. Then I said goodbye and left him settling into position by the pool table, waiting for someone else to come along. Although it was getting dark, I drove on south in a sort of fever. After the long delay in waiting to get hold of the car, I couldn't wait for the journey to begin. The sickly lights of Juarez soon tailed away behind me, and there was nothing ahead but the odd cactus silhouetted against the skyline, satisfactorily and exactly like a movie. Every so often a Greyhound bus would veer up out of the night into the centre of the road, and I would pull over. Discretion seemed a better part of valour. Somebody had told me the Mexican rule of the road when you came to what were usually single-lane bridges. The first car to flash its lights had right of way. Get it wrong and there would be no point in arguing about it later. The driving was a breeze. Now there was nothing but highway. I could drive the car as fast as I liked. The speedometer wasn't working too well, but the power underneath me felt enormous. I headed for the dwindling horizon. I felt terrific. Throughout the book, Thomson has his bag of cassette tapes that set the mood for many of the chapters and many of the adventures that he has along the way. And here is a perfect example of that. I had another tape with me that I played over and over again. I had bought it just for this occasion in El Paso. This is the story about Billy Joe and Bobby Sue, two young lovers with nothing better to do than sit around the house and get high and watch the tube. And here's what happened when they decided to cut loose. They headed down to old El Paso. They swear they ran into a great big hassle. Billy Joe shot a man while robbing his castle, and Bobby Sue took the money and ran. By the time I'd gone a few hours to this track, I was word perfect. Steve Miller went on in the song to tell of Billy Mack, the detective from Texas, who set out after the lovers to find out what had happened. But it was the glorious moral of the ending that I really enjoyed. They got away, they headed down south, and they're still running today. So go on, take the money and run. Ooh, ooh, go on, take the money and run. Repeat chorus 3 times. And music is one of the background sounds to the whole book. I pulled down a side road and came to a tiny rail crossing where I stopped for the night. The back seat was easily big enough to sleep on. I had a last cigarette with my feet out of the window, and I watched as the fireflies clustered around the glass, curious about the dying embers at the end of the nicotine. I was cold through and through when I woke up the next day. The railway ran in a straight line as far as the eye could see across the high Chihuahua plains. My little road was at right angles to it. There were a few vultures flapping around a dead coyote on the road, which cheered me up. I liked the idea of vultures and never understood why they were reviled. The difference between a vulture and a condor was only one of degree and bad luck over a haircut. As scavengers, they were just recycling, and looking at the vultures reminded me how hungry I was. I got out a map. I had, of course, thought a little about how to make the journey while kicking my heels in El Paso and waiting to buy the car. But the full enormity of my plan was just dawning on me. Mexico was a surprisingly big country. Surprisingly, because I had always thought of it as small in relation to the United States, and because the Mercator projection compressed it unnaturally compared to Canada above. According to my South American handbook, which delighted in listing such facts, there were 2 million square kilometers of country ahead of me. And not only was it a big country, but comparatively empty, with a population the size of Britain's spread over 10 times the land, and a quarter of them crammed into Mexico City. I could take the major routes, the highways like the Panamericano, but I hadn't come to Mexico to take the main routes and the Pan American Highway. I had come to get lost. If anything, I wanted to lose myself, and Mexico had always sounded the perfect place for that. Every cowboy film I had seen as a kid always took on a new lease of life when the cowboys went south of the border. Mexico was the place where they didn't have to let the other guy know they were there before shooting him. So my plan was to do it the long way, to keep heading south just like Billy Joe and Bobby Sue, but to see what happened and stop off whenever I felt like it, or more importantly, whenever there was a chance of earning some money to allow me to keep going with the journey. I needed badly to keep earning as I went, as I now had very little money left after spending $500 on the car. And then the scenario ran, I would sell my new wonderful car for a small fortune when I finally arrived in Belize. A few days later and a few more 100 miles further south, Hugh Thomson finds himself at a small ranch. He'd gone there to visit with a friend, but when the friend wants to go back to Mexico City, Hugh stays there and spends several weeks working on the ranch in exchange for nothing more than food and somewhere to sleep. Falls in love with the place, with the landscape, with the terrain that he's working on, and the fact that he's out every day on horseback with one of the other ranchers, and they move around the ranch, repairing fence posts, looking at drainage ditches, doing all the regular jobs that need to be done on a farm, and he absolutely enjoys it. The days turned into weeks. I became a literal redneck as my skin blistered and cracked in the sun. Looking in the mirror one day, I was surprised how healthy I looked. The only drink I had with me was the bottle of Ballantine's, which I eked out slowly with Eleuterio, his host, in the evenings when we sat out on the veranda under the stars, smoking and getting philosophical. When we finished the whiskey, he brought out some old Reposado tequila. Eleuterio was not a happy man. He was bored rigid by a life that appeared so idyllic to me I could imagine myself living here forever. He asked me about England and whether there was a wet season. You mean it's green all the time? Yes, because it's wet all the time. Some evenings I would feel guilty of my abandonment of the Oldsmobile and take it for a twilight cruise up and down the lane, watching the fireflies cluster again to the headlamps and catching strange Tex-Mex country and western stations on the radio dial. I had books with me too, which I could finally get around to reading by some of the writers who had headed to Mexico in search of lawless roads and a supposed lack of any moral code. D.H. Lawrence, Evelyn Waugh, Aldous Huxley, Malcolm Lowry and Graham Greene, or they were from such a different era. What's amazing, when I read this book, I went to Mexico myself as a 20-year-old, 4 years after Hugh Thomson was here, and I had the exact same books in my rucksack when I flew from London to Mexico City in preparation for spending a year at a southern Mexico university in the state of Chiapas. The exact same books. Apart from those, he says, for a younger voice I had The Catcher in the Rye, also the Carlos Castaneda tales of Don Juan and his shamanic powers. I had already asked about the local availability of peyote, and a friend had looked at me as if I were out of my mind. Cosa de Indios, he muttered disparagingly, an Indian thing. Thomson bought his car in El Paso in 1979. In 1981, I spent a week in El Paso with Carlos Castaneda, the author of the various Don Juan teachings books, and had an amazing time with him, learning about his philosophy and his way of life using the shamanic processes and rituals. And so reading this book has almost been like a parallel line for me, watching somebody else on his discovery of aspects of life in Mexico and falling in love with the wild, chaotic nature of small town Mexico. I thought about just staying and forgetting the whole car running business. Maybe I could take the Oldsmobile back up to El Paso and throw myself on the probably limited supplies of mercy of the car seller and live out my cowboy fantasies here on the ranch. But a certain stubbornness took over me. Early one morning I rolled up the sleeping bag, had my last coffee with the family and headed on south. I left Eleuterio with a Bob Dylan tape he said reminded him of Hank Williams. I like to think of him sitting out on the veranda and listening to All Along the Watchtower. Not many days later, and still avoiding the main highways and main busy roads that run down through Latin America, on small side roads in a mountain town on the outskirts of the Sierra Madre mountain range, Thomson gets pulled over in a completely routine police stop. And of course, things go from good to worse. The cop moved in slow motion. He leaned over the windscreen and gave me the once-over. Years later, I saw the film Psycho and felt for Janet Leigh when the motorcycle cop stopped her as she headed off for the motel with all the money. A certain choreography, the deliberation with which he leant over, the dark glasses, the long pause. Okay, we better talk about this. He looked at me in disbelief. Coño, tienes huevos, you've got some balls. No driving license, registration or insurance, not even a number plate. I had taken the cardboard plate off as I thought it would blow away. I may have to impound your car. He leant forward. Tell me something. Do you want a job? I couldn't quite believe what he was saying. Surely my misdemeanor hadn't just earned me an honorary place in a Mexican local police squad. A job at the sawmill on the other side of town. The foreman told me they're looking for a translator at the moment. Your Spanish is pretty good. What about the car? Like I say, I'm temporarily impounding it. He gave me various stamped official forms to study. Here is your documentación, documentary proof. It was about the only documentation I had that showed that the car existed, and I studied it with curiosity. I had always assumed that Mexicans didn't care about paperwork, that they would be too easygoing to bother. Nothing could be further from the truth. Just buying a pencil from a stationer's involved the preparation of forms in triplicate. Maybe, the policeman gave an indecipherable smile, maybe I'll give it back to you later. I had to leave the car behind the police station in town. Locking whatever I could in the trunk, he let me keep the key, I carried off essential supplies, my bag of cassette tapes, my diary, and a few clothes, in my backpack and further plastic bags. And so Thomson spends weeks in this little town called Hidalgo del Parral, and he regards it as a real cowboy town, not like the ranch where he stayed, but a place that is of foresters and cattlemen and lumberjacks. His job is to act as translator for a Canadian timber consultant who comes to work on the sawmill. Thomson goes from the police checkpoint straight out to the sawmill where he meets Zach, the foreman, who's actually from Texas. Apparently he couldn't find anyone to go and work on the new site because it was so remote. When I explained that I didn't have my own transport, although I didn't mention why, he laughed. The only way into Tejones is to fly, he said. The money sounded good, and there seemed a certain inevitability about the whole situation. Within hours of having his car impounded, he's in a small Cessna aircraft as the only passenger flying up into the mountains. This was the bandit country that Pancho Villa had headed into when on the run from the Americans. I could see how it was they never caught him. Forested mountains with deep ravines cut into them rippled away forever. The pilot pointed out some of the small airstrips perched in odd positions on the hills. One had a bend in the middle and ended at a cliff top. Dope runners, explained the pilot. Up until a few years before, this had been the main growing area for running marijuana up to the border. Then the Americans had linked up with the Federales to spray the homegrown plantations from the air in the brilliantly codenamed Operation Condor. Now the government had tried to set up small local cooperatives called ejidos to supply the big sawmills with timber as a replacement crop. The pilot sighed sadly. The farmers had gone from earning 500 pesos a day growing dope to 120 a day providing timber, which was in any case much harder work. Moments later he took me over a couple of clearings in the forest he said were still being used to grow dope. This made sense of the strange scene at the airstrip when soldiers had searched me before I got on the aircraft. And so Thomson spends the next few months working on the sawmill as a translator, going up into the mountains every few days by aircraft, and then visiting other parts of the estate by truck, sometimes taking 7 or 8 hours in the morning to go from one location to his then next site for the next few days. And of course, for every week that he stays in the job, he's earning more money, he's building up his savings, so that when he's ready to move on, he has the money to pay a small contribution to the policeman. The Oldsmobile was exactly where I had left it, behind the police station. They'd even put a tarpaulin over it. Enrique from the sawmill told me what to say, as well as contacting the policeman direct. So to a certain extent, we were just going to go through the motions. There was a particular phrase that had to be used so that honour was satisfied all around. A phrase that I didn't come across in the South American handbook. No hay otra manera de arreglar la cosa. Is there no other way to arrange this? The policeman studied the papers for one last time as if for some legal loophole, and then suggested that a donation to the Police Widows and Orphans Fund, in cash, might be an appropriate way of showing my contrition. The bribe was a token one by Mexican standards. I should, of course, have offered it in the first place. But then, of course, he wouldn't have got a job at the sawmill. We were both left happy as schoolboys by the arrangement. The policeman even bought me a drink, and then he got serious with me before he drove off. Don't try and do this in the DF. DF means Distrito Federal, or the Federal District, as it used to be called, up in Mexico City. They'll eat you alive for behaving like this. As Thomson drives further south and makes his way into the central highlands of Mexico, he starts to resent the Oldsmobile more and more. Far from being the agent of liberation I had hoped it would be, young man has car, will travel kind of thing, it brought police attention, hassles, and above all responsibilities, with the continual worry of whether I would ever get it down to Central America in one piece. This was perhaps a one-sided way of putting the argument, but that's what happens in relationships, and that's what it had become, a relationship between him and the car. I had deliberately chosen not to have a human companion for the trip, figuring that sooner or later we would start arguing and that I would always be bumping into other people for company. Instead, I now found myself inextricably linked to a hunk of machinery. It was no longer just a fun thing. We were married, with thousands of miles to go. Nor was the Oldsmobile looking its best. Already the mountains and the bad roads had taken their toll, as had all the things I kept hitting. A hubcap had fallen off, grains of sand had got stuck in the electric windows, and they were making a grating sound. The last straw came as I was driving along a small lane by the shores of Lake Chapala, a large inland lake set in the mountains. Now that I was getting closer to more populated areas of central Mexico, I had been trying where possible to take smaller roads to avoid police roadblocks. Because I was taking in the view, I was driving more slowly than usual. There were beautiful pink ferns that caught the sunset and glowed softly. The car suddenly dropped dead in the road. Literally dropped. Lying by the side of the road, as if in a practical joke, was the manhole cover. I got out of the car. I couldn't believe it. I could have cried. I certainly didn't know what I was going to do. The wheel was completely wedged down the hatch, with the whole car tilted onto its axle, like a man with his hand down a hole. It was getting dark. I thought of walking to the nearest town and throwing myself on someone's mercy to get hold of a forklift truck. Nothing else would get me out. An Indian man came by on a bicycle and stopped to see what had happened. He looked a bit like Norman Wisdom. "What you need," he said, "is a pole." I was in no mood for stupidities. "There are no poles," I said flatly. He took out his machete, went over to a sapling growing by the water's edge, and cut it down with some vigorous hacks. "There, you have a pole." Two guys came by on a motorcycle. They helped roll a boulder beside the wheel, and we used it to try to lever the wheel up. The four of us, hanging off the pole like that picture of the Marines, desperately trying to raise the American flag on Iwo Jima. It was hopeless. The wheel lifted about an inch and then plopped back into its hole. A truck came by, carrying high explosives. By now, I was getting tired of explaining what had happened. I felt like just asking the driver for some explosives. And putting the car out of its misery. At the back of the truck, the driver had a hoist. He lifted the car up while we levered the other side, and it worked. The wheel popped out like a cork. Remarkably, there wasn't a scratch on the Oldsmobile. I had some beers in the boot and distributed them all around. Then we wheeled the manhole cover over and discovered why it had been left to one side. It was the wrong size, so I left the pole sticking out of the hole as a warning to any other motorists who might come after me. That night I slept out by the lakeside on an old tarpaulin. It was a clear night and I could see the stars. I felt good again about the car, as if we'd had an argument that had cleared the air, and I also realised that I was beginning to fall in love with Mexico itself. This had snuck up on me slowly and a little to my surprise. There was something so appealing about the cards the country kept dealing me. So moral when you needed help, so amoral when you wanted wildness. I began to realise too that I didn't understand the country at all. There were horses grazing on the lakeshore, and I woke several times during the night to find them moving around me. I had an odd, hallucinatory thought as I lay there in half sleep, hearing the movements of the horses, that the stars above me were light coming through pinpricks in a tent above. At dawn I watched a lone fisherman move along the lake, casting a small, weighted, round net into the shallows with assured, casual Mexican skill. Any big fish he kept, but the small ones he threw onto the rocks with equally casual Mexican cruelty. As he worked his way along, I followed, throwing the little fish back in. I ate a breakfast of bananas and grapes further down the lake at Ajijic, watching the washerwomen laughing in their wet nylon blouses and heavy dresses. Later still, I stopped to watch a wedding procession stream out of the beautiful church in Jacotepec, confetti settling on the mariachi suits of the musicians as they played the bride and groom out. It comes as no surprise to me, really, that I could actually read every single page of this book and not get bored of it and fill probably 2.5, 3 hours with video content here. And that would be wrong for several reasons. First of all, it would take up more of the copyright material that I can allowably use in a video like this. But also it would take away your pleasure of buying the book and owning a copy of it for yourself. So there's a couple of sections I'm going to read before I wrap up this afternoon and leave you to go ahead and get the book for yourselves. Picking up on the time that Thomson spends around Lake Chapala, he references one of the books by D.H. Lawrence, a Nottingham writer, and a particular book he wrote called The Plumed Serpent, and another one called Mornings in Mexico. Thomson is critical of the Lawrence books, basically simply saying that they are flat, monotonous, and they are the story of foreigners visiting Mexico for a very short period of time. Lawrence only spent a short amount of time in Mexico, and covering the fact that those foreigners have a limited perspective on Mexico and a romantic sense of what it should be as a country. They don't engage much in the communities they visit. They keep themselves to themselves and effectively are just several Europeans on a holiday in Mexico, and then they return back to Europe. One of the weaknesses of the Plumed Serpent book, which I again read as a late teenager ready for university years ago, one of the weaknesses of that story is that Lawrence has this idea of the Spanish conquest of Mexico and of Cortes and of the clash of cultures that took place, and in some respects he captures aspects of it, but then he immortalizes or makes bigger than should be the case the role of the Spaniards in the conquest of the Aztecs. Realistically, they should be called the Nahuatl or the Mexica. But Lawrence has a limited perspective on that, and he shares it, and Thomson comments accurately on the incorrect assumptions made by Lawrence in The Plumed Serpent. But then, a few days later, Thomson finds himself with his Oldsmobile in the town of Cuernavaca and makes some very interesting comments and observations. His friend from Mexico City has landed Thomson the role of golf club manager for a site and a complex that has gone into receivership, and they need Thomson to manage it for a few weeks before the bank take over formally and resell perhaps the golf club to a new buyer. He drinks heavily. He really drinks a lot of the tequila oil because the staff member at the golf club, who is basically looking after him as the maitre d' and as the only resident within the building, says that this will clear his dysentery. I wandered around Cuernavaca on a cocktail of antibiotics, the club champagne, and a natural lightheadedness brought on by my dysentery. It was an odd city anyway, a city built as an escape. Since the time of the Aztecs, it had been a natural retreat down the mountains from the center of things in Mexico City. The bougainvillea, poinsettia, and acacia were at their most rampant in the decaying border pleasure gardens, which the ill-fated Emperor Maximilian and Carlotta used to visit. Even more evocative for me was Cortez's own palace by the main square. Cortez had built it after the conquest of the country to share with his new wife, the aristocratic daughter of a Spanish count. The building had a Moorish feel to it, which did not surprise me. Cortez, as befitted a Spaniard of his generation, was obsessed by the Moors, not just as the natural enemy, but as a source of endless romantic legend. He and his conquistadors had arrived in the New World with the Amadis de Gaul in their baggage. The Amadis de Gaul was the type of romance satirized so ably by Cervantes in Don Quixote, a saga in which single knights defeated thousands of the perfidious enemy and still got the girl at the end. Cortés, or Don Cortés, as he now styled himself, liked to think of his knights as perpetuating this age of chivalry. Cortés was as romantic as any of his followers. Indeed, one could argue without such literary precedents as the Amadis de Gaul, he would never have thought up the militarily suicidal plan of invading the huge Aztec Empire with a few hundred men, destroying his own boats and marching on the biggest city in the world. It was a graphic illustration of the power of imaginative literature, in the same way that man might never have wanted to get to the moon if it had not been for science fiction. As the 19th century historian Prescott put it in my battered old copy of The Conquest of Mexico, another book that I took to Mexico as a 20-year-old, he was a knight-errant of all the band of adventurous cavaliers whom Spain in the 16th century sent forth on the career of discovery and conquest. There was none more deeply filled with the spirit of romantic enterprise than Hernando Cortés. Dangers and difficulties, instead of deterring, seemed to have a charm in his eyes. They were necessary to rouse him to a full consciousness of his powers. Rather than settling down after the conquest was over, Cortés was always restless. He embarked on a series of ever more foolhardy projects, some fruitless voyages up to the Gulf of California in search of mythical cities of gold, voyages that ended in shipwreck and the loss of a large part of his fortune. Mexicans still call the Gulf the Sea of Cortés, while it is thought that Cortés named California after a heroine called Queen Califia in one of the romances he had read. Faced by mounting debts, Cortés went back to Spain to plead with the emperor for more money. This was a mistake. He was kept waiting forever in the anterooms of the Habsburg Empire. In a bizarre fulfillment of all his early fantasies, he ended up fighting the Moors at the siege of Algiers and was outraged when the rest of the Spaniards abandoned their attack. To make matters worse, he and his son were shipwrecked and lost the most precious of the surviving Aztec crown jewels. Worn out by litigation, he died while still in Spain, his reputation eclipsed by the yet greater riches that his far more brutal follower Pizarro had since achieved in Peru. So there was never much time for him to enjoy the palace in Cuernavaca. One of the many things I love about this book is the way that Hugh Thomson, for his natural style, I've read other books of his, but for his natural style, he blends observation with awareness of history through the reading that he's doing as he makes his journeys. That's his perspective on Cuernavaca, and it wasn't just about getting a job at a golf club for a few weeks or maybe a month whilst the bank waited to sell the venue. He also needed to see the palace and look at the history of Hernán Cortés, who had had that palace built for him. But let's leave Cuernavaca and move much further south And now he's moving towards Palenque and a very famous archaeological site of the Maya civilization. I was getting closer to the ruins of Palenque. I had wanted desperately to see some of the Maya sites, one justification for having the car. The rains came on as I approached, and I peered out at the jungle shrubs surrounding Palenque through a windscreen that even the Oldsmobile's powerful wipers could not keep at bay. I discovered that, according to the locals, it was always raining here, that each of the neighbouring villages laid claim to being the wettest place in the country, just as they do in some parts of Wales and Cumbria back home. There was a cut-price hostel in the village of Palenque, some way from the ruins, and I slept on cheap nylon sheets that slid with the dampness of the place as I twisted and turned to avoid the various biting insects. A German traveller at the hotel quoted me a line he said was Goethe's over breakfast, that anyone who thought the small nuisances of life were bearable had never spent the night in a room with a mosquito. The ruins more than made up for the night. The main buildings were raised on small mounds that had been cleared. There was a penumbra of nearby buildings that were only partially clear, and then, supposedly, many more distant ones in the circumference that had not. I remember going to Palenque, arriving there on foot in 1984, and being amazed by the scale of the buildings that you could see emerging from a blend of forest and jungle vegetation. At the back of the ruins, in the shade of the trees, was a beautiful stream where I just sat and bathed my feet for half an hour before putting on my boots again and making my way around the ruins, spending hours there and eventually being let out by the caretaker because I'd been there after the gates were locked. The Maya architecture of Palenque, whilst often being just as big as the Aztec sites that I'd seen before, was also more intimate, decorative and peaceful. The analogy often used was that the Maya, whose long-lived civilization had survived in different parts of Central America from at least 500 BC, were like the Greeks with their city-states, their learning, and their supposedly more rational and peaceful ways. By comparison, the Aztecs, whose brilliant and aggressive decline and fall was compressed into a few centuries before the Spanish conquest, were more like the Romans. The physiognomy of the Maya helped this comparison. The classic, large, hooked nose profile I saw everywhere in Palenque, whether on portraits depicted on the temple walls or on their descendants who filled my car or sold me bread. Yet if there was an analogy with any of the cultures of the Old World, it was perhaps with the Arabic rather than the Greek, the endlessly interwoven decorative motifs of the roof combs and the creation of intimate spaces among the monumental. I climbed up the main temple of the inscriptions, or El Palacio as John Lloyd Stephens described it in his vivid account of first coming here in 1839, which he gave the prosaic title Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas and Yucatan. Stephens, like his fellow American Prescott, author of The History of the Conquest of Mexico, and the explorer Humboldt, were part of a wave of interest in Latin America that grew in the first half of the 19th century and which really lifted the curtain on the continent after the long, dusty centuries of Spanish rule came to an end. Stephens wrote with a matter-of-fact vigour and enthusiasm that was refreshing after the more wearied tones of 20th century travellers. When he arrived at Palenque with his friend Frederick Catherwood, a British engraver, after a terrible journey negotiating the reins and the politics of Central America, they let off a feu de joie of 4 rounds each, being the last charge of our firearms. This was, as Stephens engagingly points out, as much to warn the locals of their powers of self-defence as out of exuberance. But it was his account of their first night in the ruins, when they slept in the Palacio itself, which was so compelling to me. The rain continued with heavy thunder and lightning all the afternoon. In the absolute necessity of taking up our abode amongst the ruins, we had hardly thought of our exposure to the elements until it was forced upon us. At night we could not light a candle, but the darkness of the place was lit up by fireflies of extraordinary size and brilliance, shooting through the corridors and stationary on the walls, forming a beautiful and striking spectacle. What they had first seen lit up by the fireflies, and what Catherwood was then to capture in drawings that remain the epitome of the romance of lost civilization, were some of the most beautiful Maya inscriptions and temples that have survived. I am in awe of this book. Every scene that he captures in his diaries and his notebooks, and subsequently years later transforms into this wonderful manuscript called Tequila Oil, Getting Lost in Mexico, is a pleasure to read, an absolute joy to work through page by page by page. For me, this has been the fastest ever read of a travel book that I've ever undertaken, and adored the way that he captured the essence of and the character of Mexico. Also, the fact that he has steeped his stories in reference to local history, national Mexican political history, and the accounts of explorers, travelers, adventurers, English writers visiting Mexico in the 1930s. The fact that he has done that so ably is what, for me, gives this book such depth, whilst he visits at a surface level as a traveller in his Oldsmobile. This is what gives the book such character. And I'm going to leave you here in Palenque with this final section of the book before he reaches the coastal town of Chetumal on the Caribbean coast. And there he takes a while to get the car across the border into Belize, because of course he has no papers. And without papers, he cannot technically move the car over the border and into Belize. So of course he will find help and support in resolving that challenge and inventing a little bit of bureaucratic evidence that suggests he actually had papers for the car all along. He didn't, but he goes to see a very skilled forger and moves across the border with his precious car. I'm not going to tell you what happens in Belize. That's a whole other aspect of the story, and I really suggest that you get hold of your own copy of this book, whether it's in digital format or whether it's a good old physical solid book that you can pick up and read, and which you are very likely to annotate in the same way that I have. Hugh Thomson, Tequila Oil, Getting Lost in Mexico. This has been my reading in review of a really fabulous book. Thank you, Hugh Thomson. I hope we get to meet up soon. This has been a tremendous experience and has taken me straight back to my early 20s living in Mexico and enjoying it just as much as you did, and causing you to write that book. And if you get hold of a copy of this, happy reading.